don't know, the International Chamber of Commerce is the world's largest business organisation, representing 45 million companies around the world, and the only business group with observer status at the United Nations. I'd like to welcome you today to this panel session on the business case for revitalising the multilateral trading system, and a big thank you to the Geneva Trade Platform for putting this event on and hosting us today. To quickly set the scene, the global trading system is clearly under strain. Even before COVID, we were seeing rising protectionism, increased use of tariffs and subsidies across almost all major economies, and very little multilateral progress in creating new rules for the 21st century. For years, governments had principally turned to bilateral and regional free trade agreements, resulting in a thicket of complex and overlapping regulations. Towards the end of last year, the WTO's appeals court came to a grinding halt. The system was not looking in good shape. Then, of course, COVID hit, and with it, new trade restrictions, including export restrictions on PPE, medical equipment, and food, plummeting trade volumes and economic activity, and the looming prospect of what many call vaccine nationalism. So perhaps it goes without saying that none of these developments have been particularly good for business. And that will be the focus of our panel session today, where we will ask, what would it take to make the global trading system work for its ultimate end users, businesses trying to do commerce abroad? And to discuss this topic, we are joined by four great panelists. Daniel Crosby, a partner at the leading law firm King & Spalding, whose practice involves advising governments and corporations on international trade matters. Today, we will benefit from his wise counsel. Sarah Thorne, Senior Director of Global Government Affairs at Walmart, which is the world's largest company by revenue and the largest private employer in the world, with operations in 27 different countries. Sarah is responsible for managing international policy issues, where including trade rules and global supply chain policies. Sarah English, Vice President of Global Public Policy at MasterCard, who leads the company's global trade agenda. And Krishnan Ramadurai, Head of Capital Management at HSBC, the bank, where he works in trade finance in a practice that is generally regarded as world-leading. Krishnan has also been heavily involved this year in the work of the B20 on trade. So we will have 1 hour of discussion among the panelists, and then we will open up the floor to the audience for the remaining half hour, so from 4 p.m. Geneva time. So without any further ado, let's start the questions here. And let's begin with Daniel. So Daniel, I gave a very brief overview of the current trade environment and some of the strains on the WTO system. And so my first question really is, how are companies most impeded by the WTO system as it currently exists? And what would, from your perspective as a lawyer advising companies, what would be the most important reforms that the WTO could undertake to serve businesses better? And in this connection, what principles still work and which principles no longer work?
Okay, thank you, Damien, for the question, and again, thanks to the organizers, Geneva Trade Platform, for bringing us all together under the circumstances. You know, it's not easy, but to the issue of how companies are impeded, just as from a kind of outside counsel side of observation, at the most basic level, companies, all of my clients, require certainty and predictability to conduct business generally. And to the extent those basics, we're talking in this panel about back to basics, so I really wanted to get down to that basic level to say, of course, businesses are impeded to the extent that WTO rules don't ensure those fundamental requirements. So this can relate to either the lack of rules, which we'll talk about, I hope, but also to the lack of certainty, clarity, and transparency in existing rules. Those kind of prevent members from playing protectionist games if those rules exist and if they're clear. And if they don't exist, then members can play around, as we see in the world today. So the predictability and certainty that businesses need can also only be guaranteed by a fair and functioning dispute settlement system. So that's another box we need to check on what businesses need in the end. But a main problem here is that many WTO members have kind of seemed to question the commitment to open, rules-based, market-oriented systems. And if members really believe that their citizens and businesses benefit from trade financially and in their standards of living, then we have one direction we can take. Or if trade is something we need to protect from and seek exceptions from, then we have to go in a different direction. So there's a really fundamental choice to be made there, and you can't say one thing and do another. Because if members don't share a commitment to converge around one kind of vision of core principles, that gives rise to tensions if you say one thing and do another. And that's where the issues of transparency and clarity come in. Because if you say one thing and want to do another, you don't like transparency. Because then people see that you're saying one thing and doing another. And that's the most basic rule of the WTO in transparency. So if those things exist, then members will question whether equal treatment should be applied to those members who are not operating according to the rules or who are not transparent in their operations, giving rise to questions about all of that. So to take the question of reform, the WTO needs to ensure those first points, the most basic points, but also they need to keep up with the real world of business and politics as well, because things change. And things change drastically, as you all see, within 25 years that the WTO has existed, where we've had really no new rules except for the area of trade facilitation, which is important for many companies, but certainly not the kind of reform that we need generally. So, for example, the WTO itself saw and recognized in 1998 that there was this new thing coming called e-commerce. They established a work program, all that was supposed to go forward. Absolutely nothing happened the whole time since 1998. So businesses are waiting, and the only route is to go around the WTO, really, and create a new track of negotiations that all members of the WTO don't agree on. So the question is, why don't those members agree to join that initiative, especially the ones that need it most? In Africa, for example, there's only 1 or 2 countries on the whole continent that have joined, especially sub-Saharan Africa. So one suggestion of how to make it better is to increase the interaction between businesses and the WTO. The ICC has done a good job of that, but it needs to be formalized, more regular, to have business have a formal presence within the WTO, like many other international organizations have. That for me is a must, because businesses have specific ideas for improvement and expertise for implementation. And I don't think it should be ad hoc. I just think it should be brought inside along with other stakeholders as well, not just business. And as part of that interaction, my second suggestion is to the transparency point on the basics, is allowing businesses to consolidate information regarding members' laws and practices and make them available on the internet. That's one of the biggest problems we have at the WTO. There's no functioning way to do that. It relies on voluntary submissions of information. It should be a public good that the WTO has. If the WTO members are not doing it, business should just step in and take care of that problem. The ICC could maintain that database, or the information could be forwarded either to one of the international kind of NGOs that consolidate such information and ultimately pass it to the WTO for verification and publication, so that all other businesses can refer to that information in a transparent way. So I will end there and leave those suggestions for discussion.
Fantastic. Would any of our other panelists like to comment on some of the ideas there that Daniel has put forward? Feel free to jump in if so.
So I just echo the points made by Daniel Crosby. Because of the work we've done at the B20 Trade and Investment Task Force. The policy paper makes specific recommendations exactly to the points of which Daniel just made in terms of increasing the interaction with businesses. And we recognize the ICC has done some important work in this, but the key point made by Daniel, which I would like to reinforce, this needs to be formalized because the expertise sits with the business, right? And similarly, what he talked about on transparency and having an independent party, when notifications don't take place, all this is again there as part of our recommendations in the policy task force. So it just needs to be carried forward. And I think an important point here is the G20 needs to pick this up in the next 1 month or so.
Yeah, I just lean in on the comment about certainty. We, I think, took for granted that people were going to play by the rules. And we have relied so much on this forward liberalization and thinking about how we lower trade barriers that it really was a shock to our system when we saw governments putting up barriers and increasing tariffs. And it is very, very difficult to conduct a global business when you don't know what the rules are. And so it made us, as Walmart, feel more strongly about making sure that we have a resilient and modernized WTO.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Sarah, maybe we'll stay with you for the moment because you just mentioned sustainability here as well, and Walmart is clearly internationally regarded as a world leader when it comes to sustainability, and has done so much internally, notwithstanding whatever government regulations might compel it or not to do. And so when we think about sustainability and the trading system together, from your perspective, does the trading system do enough to encourage sustainability? And what does what do progressive companies looking to make meaningful climate action like Walmart want from global trade rules? And sort of in this connection, is there more that can be done to cohere the climate rules and the trade rules?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. And I just want to thank you for moderating this panel and the organizers for putting it together, because I think it's critically important we think about the trade rules as we think about how companies and governments are evolving to think about not just shareholder capitalism, but stakeholder capitalism. And so that means everybody has to be thinking about what we do and how it matters. And we spent a lot of time last week with the UN system, with the WEF, with others talking about climate. And I was thinking, boy, we really need the other Bretton Woods institutions to be leaning in here as well. So to answer your question succinctly, no, the WTO is not doing enough to meet the needs of regenerative companies, of companies that are thinking about climate and nature and dignity at work. You mentioned we made some announcements last week to get to net zero by 2040 and to put ourselves on a path to being truly what we would call a regenerative company. And that means not just simply thinking about how we protect nature, but also how we build and regenerate, because as a company the size of ours, as you mentioned, we just can't exhaust unfortunately, all of the resources of the planet, nor can we live in a world where people aren't treated with dignity. And we're not the only ones. If you look at the major Fortune 500 companies, most of these companies have embraced this idea that we need to think about ESG as a critical and core competency of our company. That what got us here is not going to get us there, and we need to think differently about our role in society. Governments, and certain governments, are starting to think about climate and nature, and they're moving ahead with policy. Businesses are moving ahead, but I worry that the WTO is not. And so we wrote a blog op-ed last week with the WEF that came up with some recommendations for the WTO to put itself in a path to being part of the system and part of the solution. And it goes back to what Daniel was saying about certainty, because if all governments are taking different actions and all companies are taking different actions, I really worry that those countries and those smaller businesses aren't really going to have a great roadmap. And we could have kind of this balkanization again of here's the standards for country X, and poor country Y doesn't even know that they're supposed to meet these new product standards or do due diligence in their supply chain. So the recommendations are not earth-shattering. They are finish the fisheries subsidies negotiations. I mean, get on with it. You pledged to do it. It's an SDG. And as a company that is working and has pledged and was one of the first companies for our private label to sustainably source fish, it is galling that governments would put subsidies on production to increase production. Well, we're here trying to say we need sustainable fisheries and we need people to make sure that they're treated with dignity on boats. Just do it. This is not that hard. It's a question of political will. And yes, I get that the politics are hard and there are artisanal fisheries, but in the WTO, we actually have systems for dealing with subsidies. We know how to classify subsidies. We know which subsidies are bad, production distorting subsidies. So just do it. I mean, I think it's a litmus test for the WTO. And we're watching. Everybody is watching you. So we would say, finish it, rule one. Two, most companies are thinking about circularity. And so to be a truly, circular company, we need access to products and services that will sustain the planet. And so the fact that there are tariffs or non-tariff barriers on environmental goods and services just makes no sense. So we would like to see those negotiations brought back to life. I do think there's a lot of political will to get it done. And if it can't be done by everybody, bring the plurilateral back. Let's just go. And then the last bit, and we have other recommendations, but I know time is short, is a lot of countries are going to be thinking about border mechanisms, prices on carbon, all of these things. The WTO has to lean in here. They have to be thinking about, because everybody says, oh, it's going to be consistent with WTO rules, but then they all ignore the rules. Well, how's that going to work? We need to actually bring these environmental agreements into the WTO. And also we need to make sure that they're all mutually reinforcing. Because what we're seeing now is the silos. I'm going to do this in the environment. I'm going to do this on labor. I'm going to do a little over there on migration. Oh, wait, let's negotiate something on decent work and supply chains. No, we got to bring it all together, and the UN systems need to talk to each other, and they need to make sure that all these rules that you're asking business to adhere to, or rules you don't have, are mutually reinforcing. Thank you. On mute.
Thanks so much. And I really am glad you mentioned fisheries as well, because, I think there is a lot of, there's an idea out there that businesses don't care about the fisheries subsidies negotiation, but it's clear from your remarks that they do. And not just for those reasons, but also for the systemic importance of the WTO. I mean, if the WTO cannot get this done, after having been ordered by leaders in the UN, after agreeing to a time frame themselves, I mean, what can it do? And so there's this systemic importance to it as well. Did anyone have any sort of reactions to Sarah's comments there? Maybe Sarah, we haven't heard from you yet.
Well, I echo Sarah's enthusiasm in terms of, the need to update rules. And I think this is equally true for the digital economy. We've had these e-commerce negotiations now for almost 2 years. And the progress, I think from a business community perspective has been quite slow. So I just think it's really an inflection point. And I know we've talked about this before, but businesses, like Daniel said, need certainty. And in our space, in the digital economy, there's really a lack of rules. There's a lack of consistent standards. And that really makes it so challenging for companies like us to deliver services and to really bring in everybody into the digital economy.
Daniel.
Yeah, I wanted to. I thought what Sarah said was amazing, and both Sarah and Sarah. But to the point of being upset that countries, members of the WTO, are not ready to do these things, and we should just have a plurilateral. That kind of raises the question of what do you do? How do you treat those members and their products when they don't agree to come into the fisheries subsidy negotiation, when they don't agree to respect international commitments on environment and labor and all these things? Back to my first kind of observation, that countries have to walk the talk. If they say they respect ILO, basic labor rights, but they don't want to really follow those rules and don't want WTO rules on those things, what do we do? How do we treat their products? How do we label them? How do we give them an incentive to say, look, if you don't follow these rules, you're not going to trade with me the same way that I trade with everybody else? Because current rules at the WTO seem to suggest that a plurilateral means it's MFN at the end. You have to give everybody the same treatment. And I don't see how we're going to get out of that unless we kind of have a new system almost. So how do you treat the governments who and their products who don't sign up for these basic principles?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the idea of the MFN principle is something we need to look at. I personally am not one to throw it over yet, because I think I fundamentally believe liberalization is good, and the countries that liberalize actually benefit. So, I worry that we get into this more mercantilist approach. But I think it's something we need to look at. I also think, if you think back to when the WTO was created, I think it was like you're in or you're out. When you want to stay with the GATT, you stay with the GATT. Or you come in. Maybe we need to be like the multilateral, be the MTO now. Be like, we're all going to go over here. And if you want to be out, you stay out with the WTO. We're going to go over the MTO or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, because I don't know how you shock countries into action when they're kind of used to being like, no, we didn't get consensus. We're not going to do it. No. That doesn't really work with like how we organize our family. One person doesn't get a vote and get to say no. We actually have to like move things along sometimes.
Well, there are some really big issues there. MFN, the consensus principle that we're talking about there. Sarah, is that something that you have views on as well? Is it time to rethink these ideas?
You're talking to me, right?
Yes.
MFN. I have a slightly different opinion of MFN, and I think it stems from just our experience with trade rules. I think there's really time. It's really time to take a really hard look at MFN, and I think some of the agreements in the past that maybe did not conclude, like TISA or the EGA. Those were open plurilaterals, right? They were, or even like there's a reason why regional trade agreements are so popular. It's because there's more political will, there's more coalitions of the willing coming together, and I'm talking about TPP, maybe USMCA. There really needs to be a hard look at MFN, and I hope that I feel like this is a really important time, not only in the world because of COVID, but because the WTO is really at a crossroads. And I think they should really be using this time to, first and foremost, make a successful ministerial. That is so important. And I think there's just a few things on the agenda that can be done that can be seen as successful and show the world that this institution still matters and it still works. And by that, I mean, there are some things on the reform agenda that can be easily achieved. There's the fish subsidies that Sarah mentioned. They should be able to complete that. And honestly, the e-commerce agreement should be able to be concluded as well. So if those three things kind of come together, I think that will show the world that, and show, hopefully US leadership can be part of that this institution matters and it's important and it works. But I do believe that we'll continue to see more regional agreements, more open plurilaterals, because I just think that that's a good way of sort of bringing on those that maybe are so hesitant to take on some high standard commitments. So I think that will be, and how that becomes part of the WTO eventually is remains to be seen.
Well, let's stay with you for a moment, actually, and drill down a little bit into that third pillar that you said was really important, the digital trade rules. So, obviously these e-commerce negotiations have been going on for a couple of years. Progress has probably been relatively slow, perhaps, but at the same time, it's one of the few areas where we're seeing progress at all. So, from your perspective, from a company that is really both at the cutting edge in terms of technology, but also a global company, I think you operate in over 200 countries. How outdated are the WTO rules for a company operating in the digital economy? How important are these negotiations, and what's next? What more can be done?
Yeah, so I think we should really pause for a moment and think about where we are today with the pandemic. For better or for worse, the global health crisis has really made it impossible to ignore the challenges and sort of the trends that have been growing for some time. And what I mean by that is access to the digital economy. And it's quickly becoming a dividing line between what countries and businesses are able to get through the situation with minimal damage. But it's also accelerating the shift to digital tools and services and payments, and has really shown that the digital economy is really not from a nice to have, but really a necessity these days. And from our perspective, too many people and SMEs remain disconnected from the formal financial system. And that's going to impact us all because we can't have the internet of everything without the inclusion of everyone. And MasterCard takes that very seriously. We don't look at financial inclusion as a philanthropy. It's really part of our business model today. And so, if we look at sort of what has really triggered some behavioral changes as a result of COVID, we've seen in our own preference, in our own data, that over 70% of consumers are now planning to use e-commerce and digital payments and have this aversion to cash because of the pandemic. But what does that mean for companies like us? Because we sort of operate where there's not a consistency in global standards, because there's a patchwork of cross-border access, that really makes the situation worse. So, like I said before, the global crisis really couldn't come at a better time for the WTO, and I know that sounds sort of strange, but I am an optimist. So I think the imperative right now is to really take a look at, and I should say I've been involved in the e-commerce negotiations for more than 3 years now. And I have seen progress, but I feel like we really need to accelerate it. It's important to really get to high standards on e-commerce. And I think that there's really a challenge and opportunity. And the challenge is the rules are inconsistent, we know that, but also many countries are at varying levels of development. So that makes it challenging. But the opportunity really presents that we see the digital acceleration and countries can see the benefits of getting the rules right. So really, we want to see, standards on data flows and market access, but also on these digital services like payments that are really critical to delivering the e-commerce, the digital economy to everyone. So I think that that hopefully will, accelerate. And I think businesses being part of this agenda, being at the table, being with the negotiations is really important. And I think thanks to the ICC for doing a lot of great work in this space on, on documents and white papers and meetings like this. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Were there any sort of reflections from the other panelists on some of those comments about the digital economy, or perhaps what other trends have been accelerated on account of COVID that might make reform now even more urgent?
Yeah, I'll just say I agree 100% with Sarah. We as Walmart have been on a digital journey. We're a brick and mortar company that is now, an omni-channel company. But I think what you saw with COVID was even your neighborhood hardware store became an omni-channel company. Your liquor store delivered to your door, thank goodness. All of these things that didn't happen before were quickly enabled. And we were stunned at Walmart to see the uptick in our app because people wanted groceries delivered to their door very quickly. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, you got to download this Walmart app. I hope what it means is that countries that were resistant to the digital agenda see the benefit for small companies as well. Because we don't think it's great that there's 6 companies that are dominating or 7 companies or whatever. We actually don't fully believe that because we think that these companies have sort of led the way but are lifting up. If you look at many of the micro multinationals, many other small businesses that you would just never have any idea about. And I think like Etsy, where did I order a mask when I can't sew? And there were no masks in the stores, you know. I was like, somebody must know how to sew. So I hope that, as Sarah was saying, I hope that has sort of made everybody feel more connected to the digital economy and then understand why we need more rules and we need to make sure data is flowing. I mean, we've talked data to death, and I think it's kind of boring, but it's sort of fundamental to making it work. But then what are you doing about payments? What are you doing about trade facilitation? How are you making sure that those little guys actually can get their stuff efficiently to your door? What are you doing about returns? What are you doing about liability? All these things we have to think about and should probably be doing it in a multilateral way as opposed to each country picking, not to mention tax.
Damien, can I add one point?
Please.
So I want to bring this thing back to the first point of the basics and the stability and predictability and all these things that these rules, especially the services and digital trade rules, you know, the WTO did foresee a lot of this. Amazingly, there's a lot of stuff in the WTO, including specific to moving data. But I think countries who don't want to recognize or don't agree on the basic principle that trade is good, they want to use data restrictions as a way to protect. And they ignore the WTO rule that says where you make a commitment, you have to let data flow. So they use these little kind of, when I say playing games, for protectionism, as I said in the beginning. So the clarification of that point, if it needs clarification at all, needs to address that basic point. The other basic point is, unless a services supplier knows where they're classified in the GATS system, the Central Product Classification System from the 1990s or 80s, doesn't capture all this stuff. So to bring clarity on clarification where I'm classified, whether a commitment has been made on my service, is the most basic thing that these negotiations are trying to deliver. And the poorest countries in the world who need it most, especially in the COVID situation, are not participating in that negotiation. Is it because they don't agree on the basic principle? They think it's somehow a threat? I think all these things need to be addressed. And I think Sarah Thorne's suggestion that you have to have an incentive, which is either we go do it over here and you're part of it. And if you don't agree in principle that trade is good, that you want to be in this kind of system that works for us, then you're in a different system. And there has to be a binary decision at some point as to whether we're all living in the same system with the same rules, the same expectations, or if we think of some other way of differentiating ourselves. Still, we can all believe in trade and want to trade with each other, but certainly not in the same way. I'm beyond the MFN question. That's my final result.
Well, look, that's a great segue, actually, when you frame things in terms of companies either pursuing an open market-oriented approach in whatever areas, or a closed, more protectionist model, not believing that trade is a good thing fundamentally. We really need to think about the costs of that and what would that mean. And so perhaps I could turn to Krishnan now. As the only banker here, I'm going to ask you if we can put any numbers on that potential, the two potential paths that countries could follow. I know you and HSBC and BCP together have been doing some work on this. Right. How much does protectionism cost us?
Okay,
Thank you, Damien, for giving me the opportunity to join this panel. And when you introduced me, you did say I've been part of the core trade and investment policy task force, which was responsible for drafting the paper. And to address your question, we've published research with our knowledge partners, BCG, just a couple of weeks ago, quantifying the impact of pursuing open trade policies. But before I begin, just one caveat. While we're putting numbers or flesh to this, it's good to remember it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong when you look at these numbers. But directionally, they give you an idea of where we are going. And our research dramatically quantifies the cost of choice between rising protectionism and liberal trade policy reforms, and compared with what you get when you look at protectionism. And for G20 countries, because this was done as part of the B20 G20 focus, which approximately contributes 60% of global merchandise trade, and I'm not talking of services because, as you all know, it's very difficult to quantify. We find that if countries support open trade policies and a rule-based trading system, then it can deliver dramatic gains, something like to the tune of 2 trillion by 2025. And if you look at the multiplier effect on GDP, it's about US dollar 10 trillion. So you're talking big numbers if countries follow open trade policies. We also looked at, you need to be practical, look at the world as it is. And if protectionism is on the rise and if protectionist policies are actually adopted, then you get an adverse scenario where there is a persistent drag. Now, of course, we started with 2020 as the base year. And as you know, that this year, because of the pandemic and the health crisis and the cessation of economic activity, any scenario is going in 2021 is going to be an improvement. But most importantly, when you look at the protectionist scenario, you see it growth leveling off dramatically. And an important point here is it's not just about trade, it's multiplier effect on GDP, but also on employment, which is going to be significant, which is going to have a significant impact across countries. And the other important point, it's not just G20 as a portfolio of countries. Every country, and believe me, we've done some extensive modeling on this, actually benefits from this. So if you look at the scenarios, I talked about the open trading scenario where open trade policies are adopted versus a baseline scenario versus an adverse scenario. This was modeled using a baseline scenario of where we are in the current world. And we also looked at another scenario where, given the realities and the political difficulties of getting agreement, as all of you have said, uh, we get incremental benefits. Now, how did we, just a little bit, I won't go into too many details, but just to give you an idea of how these four scenarios were actually factored in, we built an index which was scored. And more importantly, for the points which have been discussed, the index consists of existing tariff levels, broader trade restrictive trends. And you might say, what did you look at? We looked at subsidies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, digital standards because of the digital services trade restrictions within countries. We looked at trade opening trends in terms of and some of it has been mentioned, in terms of the free trade agreements which are in place, the trade facilitation measures as defined by WTO and OECD here. We also looked at the efficacy of WTO the dispute settlement mechanism, and all of you know where the score would have been on that one. So the index at 0 is the worst, where you are in a closed situation, and 1 is the most open situation. So clearly you can see broad directionally in terms of trends, countries benefit when they adopt open trade policies. So what is it that the business needs to do, and what are we calling out? And some of it has already been said. The first takeaway which we have learned is the current way in which trade is done is hugely inefficient. Digitization offers potential. We've already talked about payments. It's equally true in the trade finance space, and this needs to be accelerated. I'll only make one point. While we're looking at digitization, there's an absolute key necessity for governments to amend legal frameworks. Give you an example. The crisis showed without electronic signatures, it's very hard. You can't base yourself on hard paper documents. We found workarounds. Governments did manage to address some of this, but it highlights the point that legal frameworks is where we need changes to be made and adopted. Second, and I'll talk about this later in more detail, trade finance powers at least 40% of global trade, and it does not get the appropriate capital treatment which it should get. And our analysis, which is part of the B20 policy paper, quantifies the impact. And as you know, Damien, WTO, ICC have said there's a trade finance supply gap. And we've quantified that by getting appropriate capital treatment, including MSMEs, you could be able to plug that gap by about to the extent of about 1.2 to 1.5 trillion. We also recommend a pragmatic approach to WTO reform. I'm not going to say more because a lot of it has already been said, like updating its rule book, bringing certainty, dispute settlement mechanism, that it continues to work. All this finds a place in the B20 policy work. What is important, and it's becoming increasingly clear, that this needs to be taken up by the G20. That's the point. We all seem to be in agreement. With that, that's it for.
Brilliant.
Hope I've
Thanks
answered.
so much, Krishna. And that $10 trillion figure about what is at stake, I think, really should resonate with governments. There really is so much at stake, and I think that's a good pivot, perhaps, to some of the new forms of protectionism that we've seen over the last 6 months or so since this pandemic began. And maybe I'll start here with Sarah English. What have you seen as the major challenges in the last 6 months? We've obviously seen in the news, at least, export restrictions on PPE, medicines, food, but there's more to it than that as well. So what have been the main challenges for you, and is there anything that the WTO could be doing more to address those?
Sorry. I think, first and foremost, we're a services business, we're a technology company. So the restrictions on, PPE and things like that have not directly affected us. It's more the reverse. It's the acceleration of people online and using e-commerce more generally. But at the same time, because of our vast data warehouse and all the data that we see across our network, we have really been able to come to governments to package our data. So we have transaction data, it's anonymized, it's aggregated. And what we do with that data is we marry it with government data and public sector data, and we are able to provide policymakers in real time how to make decisions that impact whether they should be opening up certain areas or not. And we have lots of examples where we've done this in New York City. We've done it in Paris, working with the tourism board to help them understand where do tourists shop. why do they shop, like when they shop there, and whether or not we can help them predict whether it's the right time to open up. So I think, and that's why, going back to my point earlier about data flows being so important to the digital economy, and I think there needs to be a real conversation. I know it's happening right now, but there is a lot of good data out there that is not personal data, that is just business to business data that happens every single day. And it's not just companies like ours, it's companies like Walmart, it's manufacturing companies, it's big agricultural firms. Everybody uses data. Every company is a data company, really. And I think, one of the reasons why we've seen sort of this stalemate at the WTO currently, and I'm talking specifically about the e-commerce negotiations, is on this topic. And it's a very challenging topic to discuss, but I think, it's one that if we can achieve something at the WTO, and specifically in e-commerce, that is going to be huge, right? It's going to help break down some of the barriers that other countries might be more willing to accept commitments on data flows. And I think, I'll just make one last comment, because I don't want to take up too much time, but I think, whether I have to bring up the US election because it's in 35 days, but whether or not, whoever's in power, whether it's, this current administration or a new administration, I think the WTO is going to take center stage. And I mean by that is, whether you look at what the US has done so far in the reform agenda, putting aside the appellate body, I think you're seeing an engagement on the US part, or whether it's a new administration, I think you'll see that as well. So I think that's actually a positive thing, that maybe that's not being quite picked up in the media, but I think there's definitely a reckoning and understanding that something needs to be done, and I think that's a good thing.
And speaking of the US election, just a thank you mid-session to everyone for such civil and articulate debating today. Sarah, maybe you would have comments on that topic as well. It strikes me that one of the major things that has happened since COVID struck is a renewed discourse on supply chain resilience. For a company like Walmart, there must be so much at stake there. I was wondering whether you could touch on how you are viewing those debates. What have been the consequences of some of these policy decisions for a company like yours?
Yeah, so thanks. So yes, the last 6-8 months have been fairly extraordinary from our perspective in terms of managing supply chains. And it's really just the rapidly oscillating poles of supply and demand, because it started as a supply shock when China went down, and then quickly evolved into a demand shock when our consumers in the United States bought 9 months of water in 5 days, and then have been rapidly shifting procurement. I mean, what is everybody buying today? An outdoor heat lamp. So I think the challenge we've seen is it's hard to adjust when all the supply chains break at the same time and the demand shifts are so profound, because what you're buying today you didn't buy yesterday. So, were we going back to school? Were we not? Do you need a backpack? Do you need pencils? These are all things that our teams are having to adjust to real time, using much more human intelligence, I would say, than even the algorithms that usually predict what people buy and sell. But we've been able to do it, and I think the biggest challenge for everybody has been sleep, because it just takes grit to try to manage through something like this. And where we are evolving to is, what are those two poles of resiliency and efficiency? Because you could be a 100% resilient company, but nobody could afford anything that we were selling. So, we were joking before, we've really we were very much before just in time, and now we kind of need to be just in case, which is, how do you make sure you build into your supply chains enough redundancies to make sure that if one country or one source of supply is affected, that you have a pivot? How do you make sure you don't have too much geographic concentration? And you see that in people looking at pharmaceuticals, looking at certain supply chains where you have had historically geographic concentration because it made sense from an efficiency standpoint. And thinking about more effectively, how we deliver the products and the services our customers want at the price point they want, while making sure we're mitigating risk. Now, governments were not great, I would say. Some governments were very good, understood quickly the need to have a list of essential products and services, understood that we actually have to have some certainty here. But I would say we procured a lot of PPE, not just for ourselves and for our associates and for our customers, but for the government, at the government's request. And it was very frustrating for me to see governments putting in policies that would put export controls on necessary equipment, because it undermines, first of all, your business model when you have a contract and all of a sudden you can't get it. But also the confidence in the system, because if you say, I'm going to put an export control on food or an isolate gown or mask, then why would everybody's automatically going to say, well, then I need to produce it all here, which is not per se the most efficient thing, nor the most resilient approach, which is the other thing that we're seeing, which is make it here, by name the country, by X. We're going to put all of these rules in that say you have to produce it here. Well, producing it all in one country is also not very resilient, because look at what happened to our meat supply in the United States. We just had too much concentration. So what we're looking at now is, how do we make sure we are thinking about risk, we're thinking about risk mitigation, we're thinking about geographic diversity, we're certainly thinking about make it in the U.S. We're a U.S. domiciled country. We have a commitment to U.S. manufacturing. But what we have found is the tariffs that our government put on intermediary goods, parts, have made it harder to produce in the United States. If you onshore a bike manufacturing plant in South Carolina and then put tariffs on bike parts, it's kind of hard to compete when there are no tariffs on finished bikes. So, again, this idea that we need the rules of the road to be consistent, we need to be pro-liberalization, that will help us, I think, with all of these issues related to manufacturing, resiliency, et cetera.
No, thank you so much. And just a quick note to our audience. I mean, we'll be finishing the panel discussion here in about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. So if you do have any questions, you feel free to put them in the chat, and we can line them up. So perhaps now we could turn quickly to one of those other systems which supports trade in addition to supply chains, the trade finance market. And Krishna, I know you're a specialist in this area, and I think trade finance has had less media attention on it than the challenges that supply chains have had. But I was wondering if you could give us an overview of the current state of the trade finance market, what pressures it might be under, because there have been reports of there being insufficient credit in the market even before COVID, and prospects of there being insufficient credit to actually finance trade transactions once demand returns. So it'd be great if you could run us through that if you can.
Sure. So I'll first start with the current state of the trade finance market. And as you correctly identified, it's fragile. But in my view, it's a tale of two parts, because at the beginning of the crisis, we did see banks step up to the challenge. And particularly if you see large corporates, they drew down, finance was available. And at least in the UK, where I'm based, we did see that a lot of the large corporates had drawn down their credit lines and had utilized them, and it was available. There was plenty of liquidity. But it's equally fair to say that it is the mid-market corporate companies and the SMEs who have borne the brunt of the lack of financing. As the crisis has gone on, given the fact that we've had a health shock and, as has been correctly said, a supply shock followed by the demand shock, You also need to understand that banks have to protect their portfolios and their capital ratios, given that they've just come out of the global financial crisis, even though it was only 10 years back. So it's fair to say that the government stepping in at that particular point in time was extremely useful in terms of their loan support programs, and also the fact that they stepped in to ensure that insurance companies and multilateral agencies like the export credit agencies made available export credit covers and at the short end of the space, because for whatever reasons, it's funny, in the EU, if you look at it, which is was a block of 28 countries going down to 27, uh, insurance companies by regulations were not allowed to offer short-term trade credit insurance. But amending regulations, and here at least the government stepped in, has helped to meet the some of this demand. But as the crisis has played out, uh, MSMEs certainly are impacted. And let's also say there have been defaults, particularly in the commodities space. We've seen small and medium, and once again, it's the mediums, mid-market and small and medium enterprises who are impacted. But an important point I want to make here, this is in sectors which were already stressed before the crisis started, like the oil and energy sector. It's also fair to say an important point here is most of global trade is dollar-based, pretty much the predominant currency. This is central thinking. If you look at the IMF and the Basel Committee, this is now accepted fact that the dollar plays a central role. And at the height of the crisis, the fact that the US Fed stepped in to make dollar swap lines available and expanded their dollar funding facility was a key point in ensuring sufficient liquidity. That problem, unfortunately, has not gone away because dollar access to is only available to a certain set of countries, particularly in the emerging markets. Also, we've not seen that impact, particularly if you look at dollar rates. While the dollar has declined, which is normally good for trade, it's not, the decline of the dollar is more against currencies like the euro, the Japanese yen, and the Swiss franc and the British pound. But against emerging markets where dollar is needed, that has not happened. So the state of the market is fragile. And as the crisis continues, yes, we've got an issue. And also, if the support, many of the government support programs are temporary and are targeted. So if the government does not take action to extend these schemes, then we've got a serious supply gap. And this is what the policy paper identifies by. So what can be done is to ensure that multilateral development funding schemes are expanded and made permanent, because some of them are temporary. Government loan schemes are also expanded. And some of the other work which we need to do as part of the changing the trade finance ecosystem is to make the asset class capital markets friendly. And here what I mean is to standardize the product. And when you look at legal frameworks, bring in amend the Negotiable Instruments Act to have e-bills of exchange, which can expand the capital markets. And also, as part of this, we've opened conversations with the Committee for Global Financial Stability, which sits as part of the Basel Committee, to do a study on trade finance and to address this supply gap. That's where I leave it with.
Fantastic. Did anyone have any comments on that? Yeah.
Can I just 10-second comment? The way to address those issues is by having stability, security, and predictability in the rules. And all the services that Krishna just mentioned in insurance, in finance, should be scheduled under the GATS commitments, but they're not. In most of the countries who need it most say, I need this, you're not giving this to me, I'm left behind. But the best way for them to address their own weakness is to provide stability for companies like HSBC or anybody else who wants to supply this service to do it under terms that are clear and transparent and predictable. And that is the problem here, especially that you have rules that prevent insurance suppliers from supplying their services. Like Krishna said, short-term insurance. They all of a sudden have to change the rules under COVID. Why? Why didn't they do that before? The solution is back to the basics. Transparent, predictable rules.
I think that is our mantra of this afternoon's session. So just looking at the time here, maybe we could do a quick run around the table to summarize. So I just need to go around and ask each participant for their top 3 changes that they would like to see from the multilateral system to make it properly serve business. So maybe we'll we'll start with you, Daniel, given you're on the screen, and then go Sarah, English, Thorn, and then Krishna.
Okay, just real quick, I'll give you just 3 bullet points. I think first is to hold members accountable to the principles, the big principles that they signed up for when they joined the WTO, in favor of not free trade, not necessarily open trade, but commitments that you've made. You have to comply with them. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. Right now, I think as Sarah Thorne said, there are no consequences to implementing the rules you have now or to signing up for new rules. And that just has to change. There has to be an incentive to take the rules seriously and to hit rules where they're needed, especially for business predictability and security. Secondly, on the business side, I would say that the WTO just has to interact and have personal relationships with businesses, business representatives, so that they get real information about what business needs, because really the only stakeholders of the WTO directly are businesses, consumers benefit, all that stuff happens. But really, without a formalized process of listening to businesses, you're working through the filter of government. It's a government organization. Absolutely, they'll make the rules in the end, but the inputs have to come from businesses. And third, as far as looking ahead to how to get that done in negotiations, I think business should be much more proactive in getting its plan. Not just these ideas, and what we're talking about here are all great ideas, but business has to understand the technical process for getting that done in Geneva. What's the framework? Who's going to negotiate that? Who's going to lead that? And reach out and try and provide support. Actually make sure that when the rubber hits the road in Geneva, there's an actual plan to get that done. Governments are not thinking that far ahead, and businesses need to get ahead of that curve.
So my top 3 are quite simple, and I'm going to use what Daniel said in the very beginning, which is number 1, get back to basics. And what that means is reform. We need reform. We need to get back to the basic fundamentals of the WTO. Number 2 is negotiate new rules. I mean, and this goes to the e-commerce agreement. Like, the WTO really has to complete an e-commerce agenda. It's imperative. Businesses like ours are and lots of others are going to be passing by, and we're going to have to be living in this system of uncertainty and patchwork. And then the third is be flexible. And what I mean by that is, maybe it's MFN, but we need some kind of flexibility in the system where if those that are willing to do more high standards, they can do it and have it open so that others can join once again.
Yeah, I would, my top is modernize decision making, and then modernize the agenda. Let's look at environment. Let's look at gender. We haven't talked about gender. Let's look at gender, and let's fix and get the WTO into the digital age. And then I will say unbreak the decision and dispute settlement process. I have thoughts, and Daniel has thoughts about the efficacy of the process of breaking it. but we need an effective dispute settlement because I think that does set the WTO apart. I would like to see us leaning more towards negotiating as opposed to litigating. I think the balance has been off over the last several years, and I think that's where we get to the current crisis because we're not negotiating. So if the rules aren't updated and modernized, then you just have too much weight onto the dispute side. So let's fix that.
Right. Yep. From my perspective, it's e-commerce and the digitize and services trade agreement is absolutely necessary. The only other point I'll make is having been involved in the policy process, there's a lot of good work being done also with the OECD, but I think it's the lack of political will to accept that the OECD and WTO should work together jointly, which is impeding this. Now, this is an opinion, maybe I'm wrong, but I've seen this while drafting the policy paper. And it just helps if the institutions which have already done work can use this as complementary. So that's one area which I would think which should happen. But it's hard from a political perspective also.
Well, fantastic. Thanks very much. And perhaps now we could, we'll turn over to the audience discussion point. So if anyone has any questions, please either raise your hand or type the question into the question and answer box. And perhaps in the meantime, while people find the raise hand button, Daniel, maybe we could ask you a follow-up question. So we now have a bit of a shopping list here of everyone's top priorities. How do we get it done, though? Because people have been talking about WTO reform for a long time. But given those priorities, do you see a roadmap for actually achieving them?
So unfortunately, no. I mean, there is no. Do I see a roadmap existing? No. Can I think of one? Yes. I mean, the roadmap that the WTO always uses, the process is ministerial declarations to go in a direction. If you look back to the Doha Declaration from 19 years ago now, it says, here's what ministers think and here's what we're going to do. And that's how the system functions. That process of getting all WTO ministers together on one page to have a collective expression of where they want to go hasn't happened in a long time. And maybe it's because members are not on the same page and they can't agree. And we'll see between now and we'll have a new head of the WTO soon. And then we'll have a hopefully ministerial conference next summer. And that is our chance, 7 months, 8 months from now, to confirm that roadmap. The problem is today I don't see anybody working on that roadmap. So it's even if you started tomorrow, it would be a huge delivery to get something approved at that ministerial conference. My suggestion is that that's what should happen. It's starting now, certainly, so then when the new DG comes in, maybe business has an idea of what they think that roadmap should look like, and then the DG can start kind of socializing that, and members can come around in support. Whether there's a Biden or Trump administration in the United States, the need will be the same to have a successful MC12. And I think governments are not working on that. So one thing, businesses can do it by themselves, and two, they can lobby their own governments as stakeholders to have them come in and support that process. But I really don't see either one of those angles happening right now. There should be a roadmap. I don't see it today.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So we've got a question coming in from Eduardo. If you would like to take the floor, you can, and we can put you on and you can ask it in person, or else I could read it out if you like. So maybe I'll read it out, and if you do want to comment, please let us know. So the question really relates to the dispute settlement system. which has been described as the crown jewel. The crown jewel now, however, is broken. And the question is, what do businesses want to see in a reformed dispute settlement system? So I know, Sarah Thorne, you mentioned that in your comments in passing. Maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the whole appellate body thing is a bit of a red herring, honestly. Like, yeah, we didn't like a couple of decisions about zeroing. And I know I'm being reductionist, but it really upset me that we broke it without offering a plan to fix it. That we went in and just said, hey, I don't like it, so I'm not going to participate. And you all tell me how to fix it. Now, are there challenges? Yes. Does it take too long? Yes. If it's going to take 10 years and you can keep applying, and keep challenging, then is it actually functioning? So I think we need to go back and think about, do we need the appellate body? I don't know. Can you actually just have a dispute that's a dispute and then you have to suck it up and take it? Like they decided, let's go. How do other panels function? And how are other disputes resolved in trade agreements? The TPP had some new reforms in the dispute settlement mechanism that, addressed issues of government stalling and not assigning panelists, et cetera. I think unfortunately from a layman's perspective, it just became a little too bureaucratized and too secretariat driven, and we need to just bring it back. Dan, you're going to like this, to the basics, which is like, somebody didn't play by the rules, somebody takes the case, you decide it, you implement it. Let's go. Is that too simple? Probably too simple. But I mean, that's sort of what we do in other free trade agreements.
Daniel, any response? How did you know I would ask him?
I always agree with Sarah on this, especially the observation about how it was done. I mean, I think there are lots and lots of problems about how the appellate body reached its conclusions. That's not relevant. The issue is if you have a problem with how a system is operating, I think you should at least credibly try to fix it. I think David Walker last year, the chair of the DSP, came up with a program, had some suggestions that seemed to address a lot of the concerns. We've now heard recently through an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and other kind of statements by Ambassador Lighthizer that actually he doesn't really think the appellate body is necessarily the best thing anyway. So all that process is that you don't like the appellate body or that you don't like their decisions, or I think the whole thing is not necessarily a red herring, but it has to be addressed in a different way through negotiations with a plan, with a process, and I don't think any of that is in place. It's negative for business, it's negative for the system, it's negative for the United States, and I don't really even understand what the goal is there, to get rid of the appellate body or to negotiate a new system. Whatever it is, as Sarah was saying, it just has to be done in a diplomatic, rational process. And even if it's blocked, even if the answer is, well, some country's going to block it because they don't like the consensus, well, fine. Then the plan is to go to construct your own system and have a threat that those other countries aren't included, like the United States is not included in the now existing alternative appellate mechanism. But I think that it's more of an issue of the manner of negotiating that, or kind of what I think a word that was described to me recently was vandalism, that you just kind of break something without really having a plan of fixing it. And I think that's unfortunate for everyone.
And maybe Sarah and Christian, do you have views on the appellate body impasse, or perhaps even the interim appeals arrangement that's been set up amongst a group of countries?
Not really. I was just sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Krishna. Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say I don't really have an opinion on the appellate body, but I will make a comment on the dispute settlement system because it actually impacted MasterCard. So in 2008, we took a case to WTO. It's a famous case on electronic payment services against China. and the US won. But the time it took from when we filed the case to when it was decided to when we're still waiting for we're very close to market access in China, but the amount of time was almost 10 years, right? And we were sort of, even though the decision was quite clear from a WTO perspective, as a business, and not just MasterCard, but all US payment companies were waiting for China to finally open up, right? And it took another couple of years and it took actually the phase one deal to really open up the system and lay out a process for companies like us to actually apply for a license. So I think that is also one of the biggest criticisms of the dispute settlement system from a business perspective. It takes a long time, and then how do you follow up? How do you make sure that the country that was supposed to open up actually opens up? That's to me the crux of the problem. But we need that system, right? I mean, if we didn't have that case, we would not be in China today. It's used as an example of what we mean by those gas commitments. So from our perspective, it's imperative.
And Krishnan, do you have views?
No, I was just going to, I said, echo what Daniel said, and that's about it. So nothing more to add, except also to say that from what little I know, most of the judgments which comes out are all run into thousands and thousands of pages, which doesn't really help anybody. It can be made, more digestible and concise.
And it's not sustainable if it gets printed out either. So we also have another question about services. COVID's shown the importance of e-commerce, but also services. So is there more that the WTO could be doing to promote cross-border trade and services? How important is this agenda in light of COVID? So maybe it would make sense for Daniel to start with this one.
Okay, thanks, Damien. It's interesting that you, in the context of COVID, just to share a kind of observation from the legal services provider perspective. We had a client who's been a longstanding client who always has us, when we sign contracts to provide legal services, it has to be with a physical signature, a rubber stamp, and sealed in red wax. And this is a process that we have to go through. It takes weeks to go back and forth and post. We have to pay for, delivery and all this waiting. And then something's wrong. You have to fix it. You have to reseal the red wax, all this stuff. When COVID came along, they said, well, we need you to supply your service right now. We have a problem. Can you please hurry up with that red wax? It went up to the minister. The minister said, this is crazy. I wasn't aware of this. Why do you require red wax? This whole system is stupid. Just sign the thing, scan it, and send it to me. All of a sudden, there was acceptance of electronic signatures in one day. And so that's just kind of why did we need COVID to get there? I mean, whatever, but now we're there. And so COVID is definitely kind of underlying the importance of all the, not legal services, but again, delivering everything that people need, as kind of Sarah and Sarah have said, this is all about the basics, like delivering medicines and food, and people not going to stores and crowds, and people who should be delivering, doing the delivering, and not just people kind of trying to figure it out without PPE. So I really think that the COVID situation has called into stark relief that kind of the need for trade and services. But members have always known how to deal with trade and services. There is a whole agreement on that. When the WTO was founded in 1995, there was something referred to as the kind of built-in agenda of what members were going to do because it was absolutely necessary. We haven't covered everything, and the world is changing. So in 2000, 5 years after we established the WTO, we're opening a new negotiation called GATS 2000, and we're going to take the services agenda forward. We're going to have negotiations. Everybody should update their commitments as we go. 25 years later, nothing. No negotiation, no scheduling of commitments. The stability and predictability that the WTO provides as a framework is not there for services that have changed since 1993 when negotiations closed. I mean, 1998 in financial services, whatever, some negotiations went on a little bit after the 1995. But we have a framework. We have countries who say there's a digital divide. I can't allow data to move. If you have a digital divide, it's because you don't allow services to be supplied. And so you should make a commitment to allow telecom services, infrastructure services, ICT services to be supplied in a legally protected, non-discriminatory, transparent way that the WTO rules provide for. The WTO is a roadmap for development. And in fact, the services agreement at the WTO includes no special and differential treatment. It actually is the only agreement that says trade is good, trade and services are good, and lead to development. So, I mean, I think that the best way forward for the WTO is to re-engage with its original plan, to have a serious negotiation on all trade and services. An e-commerce and digital trade agenda doesn't do enough because the digital platform is only a platform for supplying other services, and we need to know what commitments there are in those services and what's covered by them as a classification. So I really think the roadmap on services is clearly there. Members are not using it. And again, a core group of members should move ahead and say, we're doing this. And if you're not with us, you're in a different system. And we're not going to let you hold us back anymore. It's too important. We're moving ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree. The one area that I would lean in a bit though is, we were keen on the TISA. We really thought that was moving in the right direction as well. The GATS is a little complicated if you think of modes and this ways and that ways, when actually I think what we've been talking about is the interoperability of services, that services are really the backbone of a lot of manufacturing trade, of basically even other intra-services trade rely on each other. And so that's the one area that I wish we could think about. We talked about clusters, and we talked about value chains, about making sure that we're looking across value chains to make sure if I'm in doing e-commerce for small package delivery, well, how is that working with trade facilitation, and how's that working with express delivery, and how's that all working together? We used to sort of be like, oh, I got mine, did you get yours? And now we're like, oh wait, no, I need yours too. I need express delivery to work as much as I need distribution services to work. So that's the area that I think we should do a little rethink on, and just making sure when you step back that the whole adds up and all the parts align across trade. But fully support this idea that we've got to get back to the table, got to be doing more liberalization on services and value services, because I feel like in the last several years, we've talked so much about goods and manufacturing and manufactured goods when we have such competitive services sectors, and we're all, even if you're a manufacturer, you're using a ton of services to make that manufacturing plant work, or the Internet of Things is sort of reliant on services and data.
Well, I'm not going to add much more to that, what's been already said about services, but I mean, the facts are pretty clear. Services, according to WTO reports, 2/3 of the global value of global trade, right? That is huge. For developed countries, it represents the majority of jobs that are being created. I mean, the imperative to really look at services trade is so important. And that's really where the rules are the weakest. If I just take an example from our industry, from payments, something like, I think 30% of WTO members have taken even some kind of commitment on payments and money transfers. So it's really ripe for conversations. And as Sarah said, we really need to look at it holistically, because from an e-commerce perspective, you need payments, you need logistics, you need the platforms, you need these integrated services that make up the supply chain in the e-commerce.
Nothing
any final
nothing
words?
much to add, except to responding to what Daniel said, special and different. While logically what he said made complete sense, having been involved with the drafting of the policy paper, special and differential treatment is an extremely sensitive subject for some countries, and it's huge political hurdles too. So how you're going to address that is difficult. I completely get the logic, but this is the reality.
Yes, which I think could be said of a lot of these issues that we're talking about, unfortunately. So just in view of time, maybe I'll just ask if any of the panelists have any final messages that they would really like to leave our audience with today, and we could sum up. So, Daniel, I know we've already done a sort of top 3 business demands, but is there what's the essence of this for you?
So I think that businesses should demand that the system reflect reality. And if the reality is that businesses, their constituents, as we heard from all the panelists, there are lots of issues out there, including labor, whatever, environment, all the other issues that are outside gender, especially that have been outside the WTO, that there should be no blunt kind of rejection, no filter of which issues can come in just because someone says no. I know, Krishna will have heard as well at the G20, there are some sensitivities there. I don't care. People shouldn't care about those sensitivities. They should come in and they should talk about them. There should be no block. There's no consensus decision on whether you start a discussion at the WTO, whether there's a rule that applies to everyone at the end. Sure, everybody has to accept that. But if they don't accept it, my one thing for business, what are you going to do? If everyone at the WTO doesn't accept the rule, if fish are subsidized, is Walmart going to sell those fish? Is the United States going to let them come in? Is the EU going to let subsidized fish into their market on a non-MFN basis? What are we going to demand of our governments of how they treat those differences? So that's the crucial issue for MC12 in setting up the next framework, and not to exclude any issues, include the sensitive issues, and especially the issue of special and differential treatment. I would say to Krishna and all the countries who push back on that, let's get back to the basics. If you don't think that trade is eventually good for development, you're in the wrong system, because that's what the preamble to the WTO says we're going to do. Are we going to give special treatment to countries that are very poor and need help? Of course, nobody agrees with that. But is every country going to say that they deserve an exception from WTO rules when it's the WTO rules themselves that are facilitating development and economic growth? It doesn't make sense. So we have to be in a system that is realistic and makes sense. And those kind of arguments are just pushing back on protectionism, and we should move on.
Fantastic. Sarah English, your final 30 seconds, perhaps?
Sure. So I think, we're, not to sound pessimistic, but we really are a very low point, economically and at the WTO. So I think, we really have to just, like Daniel said, come into this. WTO members have to make a decision to save the system, right? And businesses like us are relying on it. So there's really not much really to be done to make it worse than it is. So I think there are some really things out there, like the fish subsidies, like the e-commerce agenda, that can be achieved at the next ministerial to at least boost it up a little bit, so then the progress can go forward from there. But we sort of need a pick-me-up, and that's where I see the agenda going.
Sarah Thorne.
So I just, we've been a bit critical in this panel, but it's sort of that tough love, because I just want to leave with, we think the WTO is vital. We think the U.S. should be leading again in the WTO. We helped to build this system. Why would we be tearing it down? As businesses need rules, and the only place that I know that has global multilateral trade rules is the WTO. So we're being critical because it's that tough love. We really, really believe that this is a vital organization, and if we tear it down, we're just going to have to build it again. So let's take this reform agenda, let's move it forward. And the last thing I'll say is thank you to the Secretariat, to the WTO ambassadors, to the negotiators who are soldiering on under what I imagine is discouraging times when people are saying, I don't like it, I don't like this, I don't like that. We believe in you. That's why we are chair of the NFTC WTO coalition. We're still in. We've been there for, gosh, I'm so old, a long time, and we're going to continue to do this. So That's why we do these panels. That's why we show up in Geneva, because we believe in this system.
Krishnan, any final words?
No, just to say it can't get worse, right? And to end on an optimistic note, despite all the political challenges, we need to move forward. And as Sarah said, even incremental changes, so drawing up that roadmap in clear terms is a necessity, as Daniel said. So that roadmap can then set out what can be achieved, what cannot be achieved over a time frame. Without that roadmap, there are a lot of issues, but as people say, you can then at least start to choose.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. It seems as though there's a consensus that there's a lot of improvement that could be made, but on an optimistic note, things can only get better. So with great thank you to all of our panelists today, and on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce, I would like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us, and I wish you all the best. So thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Damien.
Thank you.